Today's Coffee with Carrie, I want to talk about the one-way video interviews. So, one-way video interviews is also known as on-demand video interviews, pre-recorded interviews. They've been around for a good while, and a lot of companies have been doing them over the last few years. A lot. It's primarily started with staffing agencies, and staffing agencies putting through a bunch of candidates in pre-recorded videos, and they would get together with the client. They would come up with, five or six kind of screener questions. They would, go out to their talent pool, temp staffing, things like that, and they would get candidates to record this kind of what they call, a black wall interview, where somebody's talking to their phone or their computer. Nobody's on the other end. A question comes up, and the candidate answers the question, or the potential employee answers the question. They have a certain amount of time that they can record their answer. And this was primarily used really to get a bunch of these recordings, put them out, give your client access to, if you're a staffing agency, give your client access to kind of sift through these recordings and really figure out who they want to bring in for an interview. And so that has really evolved over, the last 12 months to 24 months to, what do you do after those one-way video interviews in your hiring process? And, the next, plausible step in the process is to then figure out who you want to do an actual video interview with, or some companies bring them straight in person post that one-way recorded interview. So let's talk a little bit about kind of the pros and cons of one-way video interviews. First of all, if you're doing a bunch of entry-level mass hiring and you want to, get a bunch of recordings fast and have your hiring managers kind of sift through it, it's a good way to invite, if you have an existing kind of talent pool that you're sitting on that that may be a little bit stale, and you kind of want to see, who's still interested, what place in their life. It's kind of a good way to mass, email out everybody that you have opening positions and see, who takes the time to do the video interview from that perspective. However, on the candidate side, only 9% of candidates really like the one-way video interview, and there's several reasons for that. Number one, there's no interaction, and so the candidate doesn't really find out much about the position. They don't find out much about the company or the role, so they're really not invested in the process. If you look at the no-show rate on these one-way video interviews, it's really high from that perspective, because there hasn't been a lot of information found out, or they can't ask any questions. Number two, hiring managers. There's kind of a camp both ways on this. A lot of hiring managers like it because at night or on the weekends or whatever, they can sift through these interviews when it works on their schedule. However, on the flip side of that, a lot of hiring managers say it takes them more time to sift through and listen to interviews than it would if they just had done the interviews. So it depends on your hiring process and how long these videos are from that perspective. Lastly, when you think about the employee experience, the prospective employee experience, the candidate experience, if a staffing agency is doing this on your behalf, it's not really up to them to define the candidate experience and really do that. I mean, obviously, it makes their job a lot easier if they present you with, hundreds of videos for you to sift through. But from your standpoint, if they're representing your company, they're representing your brand, there's been a lot of negative reviews. So if you look at a Glassdoor or you look on Google, whatnot, if you're doing pre-recorded interviews, that's one thing that you really need to stay on top of, is how do candidates perceive this? Because you could be losing a lot of candidates if folks are writing bad reviews about that one-way video interview process. And so you really need to stay close to that and understand that there's a time and a place for it, but it may, kind of be, if you're going to save some time there, some people say it increases time, you're going to have to take some consequences on negative reviews from a candidate perspective. And then the last thing I really want to talk about on one-way video interviews is there's been a lot of talk about, does it create bias? And so, it depends. You really have to have your internal processes down to make sure that doesn't happen. If you have a bunch of videos and a bunch of hiring managers kind of doing it, by human nature, when you see the video and you kind of see the thumbnail of who the person is, a lot of people get skipped. A lot of people's videos don't get played, depending upon if you're what type of hiring manager you have. You need to really have some checks and balances in place to see, are you passing over candidates just based on, a preview image or, a few seconds of a video. Live video interviews, you can't really kind of fake that. You don't know who's coming through. And so the candidate, when it's time for their interview, kind of is presented with the person, and it's the very same as an in-person interview where you may have a resume, you may have qualifications, but you don't know, what the kind of look and feel of the person is until they show up. So that's just a little bit of tips today on one-way video interviews, some things to think about, some pros, some cons, some tips, where to use it, where to not. And that's your today's Coffee with Carrie.